Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion is part 13 of an ongoing series focused on configuration profiles in Microsoft Endpoint Manager, specifically Intune. The focus of today's discussion will be custom configurations. So, jumping right into this, here's our agenda. We're going to talk about what custom configurations are, why you might care about them, talk about some scenarios where you will use them, and we'll walk through the components, the custom configurations, with the requirements, how they work, configuring, show them to you in action, and then we will wrap up. And so this session, just up front, I'm going to show these to you. I'm actually not going to show you on the devices because on the devices it's pretty standard stuff like we've done in previous sessions, but I do want to show you that these configurations are live, that they are out to these devices, and walk through them. But the actual configurations that we'll dive into with custom configurations are things that we have seen already and beyond, right? But I want to at least show you what these are. So in terms of custom configurations, what are they, right? So beyond the UI is the first label that I use. So these are configurations that could be in the UI for sure that you want to deliver beyond the UI. I'd actually, on that statement, recommend that if the setting is in the UI that you want to use, that you definitely use the UI instead of the custom configuration, just for the security it provides and the ease of configuration and so on. But they are there, right? And you'll see them. These are configurations sometimes that are not available in the Intune UI, but are supported by the target operating system. So how could that happen, right? Well, as developers are working on different versions of the operating system, they will add different features into the management channel in the Windows world. That's MDM, right? It's MDM in the iOS and Android world as well, but they'll add different capabilities into uh, their operating system. And then the management vendors, such as Intune, there will be a period of time where they have to develop capabilities and plug that into the UI so that you can more easily configure this, right? And the vast majority of settings that you would want to configure are going to be there because of the way these teams prioritize what they put in. But there are going to be sometimes some gaps. And so I'll give you an example. Now, this is old, right? So if you look at the UI now, you will find this. But rewind the clock a few years, and there was a customer I was talking with that really wanted to manage a Bluetooth with Intune. Went into the console, couldn't find the Bluetooth settings. And so I kind of threw up their hands and said, well, I guess I have to find a solution beyond Intune. Well, no, right? If the OS itself supports managing a setting with MDM, then you can manage that setting with Intune. So the answer in that case was the Bluetooth capability for management was available through the MDM channel. It's just not something that the developers had yet put into the UI, and so we had to go down a custom configuration route. Right now, the Bluetooth stuff is in the UI, but then it wasn't. Right, so that's an example. Other things, again, new capabilities that are introduced by the OS that just aren't yet there, definitely falls into the beyond the UI kind of thing. So direct to CSP. Basically, if there's no UI option for the configuration, but you want to be able to configure it like the Bluetooth thing I just mentioned, then yeah, you can do that with the CSP. Now, that's also a term that you may not have heard. CSP stands for Configuration Service Provider, and um, basically that's the MDM channel that allows configuring a setting. Now, the implementations of these different settings are going to vary by the vendor. So the interesting thing about this is all of the major vendors, Windows or Microsoft, Apple, Google, have agreed on the standards. There's something called the Open Mobile Alliance. You'll see that again in a minute, which defines the standards for managing through MDM, right? And so all of the major vendors have agreed to that standard. All the vendors that we support in Intune, and the way they do it though is going to be different. You're going to see that coming up. That the way you actually get into some of these custom configurations, although the standards are adhered to, the mechanisms are going to be different. So why do we care about custom configurations? Well, again, what I just mentioned. This is a standard approach. The Open Mobile Alliance is this body of or this standard setting kind of approach that all of the vendors agree to. So having that be a standard approach is good. And then why do we care about custom configurations? Well, having full access to the configurations we care about. So those configurations either not yet implemented or that will not be implemented by the management vendor, whether it be Intune or AirWatch or Mobile Lion or whatever. Uh, then you can still configure it if you use custom configurations, right? Okay, so what are the scenarios we're going to talk about? So specifically, we're just going to look at custom configurations, how you configure them for Windows, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, and Android. Those are the scenarios. We're not going to get real deep in this, but I do want to show you conceptually, how this works and show it to you set up in the UI so that it's familiar. Let me just say also, there's a massive body of examples and different things for this specifically on the Windows side. There's also examples and such on the Apple side and the Google side, but there's a massive amount of documentation for it on Windows. So let's start with Windows and talk about how this works. And so the first thing, in terms of components, there are some things that we need to understand the definitions of as we get into it. So you see the first one, configuration service provider. So I abbreviated that, pardon me, in a few previous slides as CSP, right? CSP stands for configuration service provider. So what is the configuration service provider? Well, this is the place where you will go on the operating system to actually configure whatever setting you care about. The configuration service provider is going to be a combination of a configuration path plus a path to the specific configuration, and that's going to equal the configuration definition. So here's an example. This first part is the configuration path. So this indicates that we're dealing with a device and that we're dealing with a Microsoft setting, and this is going to be in the arena of a policy. I'll explain more to you about that in a minute. The policy in this case is the specific name of a configuration service provider. And then once we get that part, then we have to dig into the policy configuration service provider to the specific setting that we want to set. So first we're going to tell it this is a configuration, right? There are a couple of types. You're going to deal with configuration type settings in the custom arena, but there are other kinds of settings that you can grab. You'll see one of those coming up. And then it's going to be in the authentication arena, and it's going to be allow active or Azure Active Directory password reset. So that is your entire path to the configuration. That's what you'll put in when you're going to try to address that configuration. Now, be aware that this is case sensitive. Absolutely. And very often I'll see folks that will leave off the initial period as an example, or they won't capitalize something the way they need to, and then things don't work. So a very strong recommendation will be to make, copy and paste where you can, make absolutely sure that your configuration matches the case sensitivity requirements of it to avoid some hassles. And we're going to talk about this in more detail in a few slides coming up, right? And then also a component will be one or more what's called OMA URI configurations. OMA stands for Open Mobile Alliance, and URI, I forget exactly right now what that stands for, but it looks like this right up here. And so this is going to define individual config settings. So whenever you go set this up, the UI is going to ask you to add in various config settings for this particular custom configuration. Now you can add one or you can add multiple. It really doesn't matter. So for example, there's a typo, sorry. If you wanted to define a single unit of config, you can do that. There's another typo. That's interesting. Or if you want to configure BitLocker, where you might want to configure multiple things, you can do that all in one single custom configuration. Now, on the BitLocker side, we already have that in the UI. and configure it there. I just use that as an example. So let's look at this a bit further in terms of our documentation. So I thought about going to our website and kind of flipping through it interactively. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to show you the websites here. And so here's a top level website that you would want to become very familiar with if you're looking at configuration service providers. So if you look up Windows configuration service provider reference, you'll find this very, very easily. And so this document gives you a lot of detail about dealing with the configuration service provider. And then along the left-hand side, it will give you a full list of all of the available configuration service providers. So I mentioned that I was dealing with the policy config. Back on this screen, I was dealing with the policy configuration service provider. I mentioned I'd show it to you in a minute. Here it is. So this is what I'm referring to, policy configuration service provider. It's one of many, right? This happens to be one of the one of the largest uh, areas of possible configuration, as you'll see, but it's here, right? And so if I want to understand what all is offered by the policy configuration service provider, I just click on it and go into it, and I will see this, and this will tell me all about, what the options are for the configuration service provider that I can use, drill into it, etc. If you scroll down, you're going to get to this screen where it kind of calls out how you would actually address it if you're looking for something that's in the scope of the user. Here's the way you would deal with it. So this is setting a config. Here's also pulling a result. I've never had to do that in Intune so far. I don't even know if you can, to be honest. But this is very absolutely what I will deal with in custom configurations. Here's one for devices, right? So same kind of deal, just as an example. So hopefully pretty straightforward. Again, the documentation gets into significant detail about how this all works and how you structure it together. And then if you drill in a little bit more and go down, you'll see all of these kind of organized by topic. And so again, let me go back for a minute on the list. So I mentioned that you will have an area that you want to actually configure. So here is an area that you want to configure. And let me actually show you another thing too. Here's the area you want to configure. You know that that area is something you have to figure out because notice this is all the way down to the particular policy, and you're going to do config, and then all of this is in italics. It's in italics because this can vary based on what you want. Within the area name, you're going to have a policy name you need to configure, and then that's what I'm showing you here, right? So this might be the area name, and then this is the configuration, area name and configuration, right? Here's cellular, here's connectivity, up here's camera, tons and tons and tons. If you want to see how to actually configure these, you'll click into one of them, and then you'll be able to see that detail. All right. So again, dig into that absolutely. Figure out what you have at your fingertips, what's out there, what might not be in the UI yet that you might want to use. It's all out there to take a look at. Okay. So in terms of requirements to set this up on Windows, you do need Windows 10, 1607 or better, or Windows 11. Any supported version of Windows 10 or Windows 11 is suitable these days. These versions of the OS, and so the options you have for just like you do in the UI, the options that you have will be different based on the version of the OS you have. In some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, right? So let's actually see how this works. And so the first thing I try to set up is to show this to you graphically. So here's the configuration screen that I'll show you in a minute in Intune for setting up the custom configuration. When you look at a Windows PC, there are actually two configuration providers. There's the built-in MDM configuration provider, and that's where all of the custom configurations will flow through. And then there's this other thing called the Intune Management Extension. So the Intune Management Extension, if you're not aware of what that is, there are certain things that you might want to manage on a Windows PC that you just can't manage through the traditional MDM channel, such as Win32 apps or PowerShell type stuff, right? And so whenever you first enroll your device in management, then the device will automatically install the Intune Management Extension. You may not even know it's there, but it should be there as a service, right? But The custom configurations flow through MDM and then flow down to the device, just like you would probably expect without seeing the slide. Just a note, so for settings where they were created using something like a string or base64 XML data type, the stored value is obscure, and that's done for security. So the user who's accessing the value, if they have certain rights, though, they're going to be able to see that value. So just be aware of that. If there's certain sensitive information that you're trying to obscure in the UI, that you will have that visible to people that have the rights to be able to see it. Okay. All right, so moving on. So let's actually configure this. And the in-action piece, usually that's where I will show you on a device that the setting is there, that it's taken effect and so forth. Not doing that in this particular set of configurations because it's kind of a rinse and repeat of things we've already done. I just want to show you the specific way that you can set these through Intune. All right. So to do that, let me pull in my Intune console, bring it over here, and show you what I have set for Windows. So underneath here, I'm going to go to Devices, and then I'm going to go to Windows as soon as the UI catches up with me. Then I'm going to go to Windows, and then under Windows, I have Configuration Profiles. So I actually have two configuration profiles that I've deployed. One pretty straightforward right here. So here is an example of deploying a very simple Boolean-based configuration profile. And so if I go edit my settings, then I will see that I have this option to add. And so I just have one setting in here. I could add another one, and I could add 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever I want, depending on the scenario. In this case, I just have the one, and I'm going to click on edit to show you how I built this, right? So here's the name, allow Azure Active Directory password reset. I didn't care about the description. Here is my path to configure it. So here's the first part that takes me down. It says I'm using the policy CSP and I'm going to configure something with it. Then this is my area, authentication. And then under authentication area, the specific setting that I care about. Again, all of this is case sensitive. So you want to be very aware of what you're typing. And then in terms of data type, I said Boolean, it's actually integer. And my value is 1. So one of the easiest kind of things to set up in the custom world is when you have a Boolean or an integer or something like that, right? And it goes down, you deploy it out to your devices. So I assign this to a group. Let me get rid of this. I assign this to a group. And so this should be, should have taken effect. So assignments, yeah, I have this group of devices. In fact, it's just one device. And so if I look at device status, it should say success. And it does, right? And if I look at the per setting status, which is really cool, if I have multiples specifically, it should tell me configured successfully, right? And it will as soon as this comes up. All right. Okay, there it is. Let me get rid of that. So yeah, successful. So that's really easy. So the actual configuring of this in the UI is not hard. It's pretty straightforward. It's understanding it before you get to the configuration part and getting the right stuff that you want to configure. That's really important. So here's another one. So custom configuration 2. This is using an XML. And so for this one, if I scroll down and look at it, I have the same kind of thing, really, where I'm supplying the path to the configuration. This is always on VPN, user focused, and so forth. So here, this is my policy, or this is my configuration area, and this is what I'm actually setting, right? So forth. And then here's the XML that I want to pass in. So getting this, getting the right XML, important. And then once you have it in the right format, just copying and pasting it into Intune is the direction to go, and then deploying it out like normal. And so here, I don't even think I deployed this one. Let me see if I even deployed this one. I don't think I did. Let's see. So assignments, did I? No, I didn't. I didn't even deploy it. So because I had the first one, I didn't worry about this one. So that's Windows. And so, again, not hard conceptually to get this done, but definitely something that you can take advantage of if you know it's there. In terms of troubleshooting tips and tricks, I'm also not going to really dig into this because it's a rinse and repeat of what we've already done, and it kind of works the same way, whether it's a UI-based setting or a custom setting, you troubleshoot it the same way, right? So I'll leave that section for now. So now, iOS and iPadOS. So the concepts here are the same. It's just how you get those things done that are different. And so for iPad iOS, a couple of components that we need to talk about. First is how do you actually build these configs? So in Windows, we see that we have a reference where we see the CSP, we can see all of them, we can build it manually in the UI and so on. That's not true for iOS and iPadOS. Instead, what you do is you use a tool, one of several tools that are available, two of them from Apple, to be able to build these configs. So if you have a MacBook, for example, you can use Apple Configurator to build your configurations, save them as a file, usually .mobile config, and then be able to import those into Intune, right? There's also a program called Apple Profile Manager that you can use. That's with Apple servers, and that's a valid way to get your configuration as well. There's a third one. I usually don't talk about third-party software, but in this case, I'll just mention it's something called iMazing uh, Profile Editor. I'm going to show it to you real quick. And it's a way, and so these two, Apple Profile Manager, Apple Configurator, require an Apple device to actually set them up. So iMazing is actually an editor that you can use on Windows devices, and it looks like this, right? So this is third party. It's not going to probably be updated as quickly as the Apple tools are going to be, but it's also a really nice way to be able to look at the configurations you can build and so forth with the various OSs. So you see Mac OS, iOS, tvOS. So make sure that you're selecting the right choice whenever you're dealing with your config, right? And once you have that built, you want to save it out. I'm going to go ahead and open a file that I've saved so you can kind of see the config area. So here's my mobile configs. I've got one for iOS. I've got one for Mac OS. I'm just going to open this up and you will be able to see the particular config. Well, did I actually cancel out of the tool? I think I might have. Let me open it up again. Oh, there it is. It just came up. Okay, cool. So it just came up. And these are my two areas of configuration, right? So I have device restrictions and general. So that's how I get my mobile config file that you saw me open, right? In addition to that, you need to make sure the setting you choose is supported on the OS that you're going to target. So be very aware of that, right? There are different versions of the OS that will support some settings and not others. So in the iOS arena, I think of settings that were introduced with iOS 15 as an example, that if you have an iOS 12 device, those settings may not be there. So just be sure the setting that you're trying to configure is actually available on the device, and then you should be fine, right? So in terms of requirements, you just need a supported OS version for whatever config you're trying to put down there. Here's how it works. So you either have Apple Configurator running on a Mac OS, Apple Profile Manager running on a Mac Server OS, um, and then I didn't include iMazing, but you saw that you can actually use iMazing as well on a Windows PC. You're going to configure what you want and then export that config to a device, whether it's a Windows or a Mac, it doesn't matter. The device here is going to be running the Intune portal. Through the Intune portal, you will import that .mobile config file into Intune, then you'll deploy it down to your devices like normal. So again, a note here, use your custom configuration profiles if you need them, but it shouldn't really be an option for sensitive information, just like it shouldn't really be the first choice on Windows for sensitive information, because that information uh, will be more available than if you do it in the UI, right? So just be aware of that. Okay, so in terms of configuring this and seeing it in action, let's go into the Intune console again and look at now iOS devices and see how we do this over there. All right. So let's see, iOS, and then I have one example in my configuration profile here for iOS, and it's right here, right? And so if I'm going to go create one new, then I would just go click create, kind of the same picture or same UI that you'll see. But if I edit the properties of this one, you'll see I already have the mobile config imported. So I'm going to give the configuration a name, and then I'm going to go and browse to the mobile config file that I want to use. And so this is where I would choose my iOS mobile config file, which I've actually already done. And then the XML representation from that mobile config file will come in, and then we'll just simply deploy that like normal. Now, I have deployed this, and it was successful. But as I look back at this before starting the recording, something happened that it was pending, and it probably still is. But it was successful earlier. Trust me on that because it was. But somehow this flipped to pending. I'm not exactly sure why. But that is a valid configuration I could push down to my iOS device without a problem. Right? Let's get that out of here. And then macOS is very similar. Right? Troubleshooting, same thing. We're just going to bypass that. It's the same kind of troubleshooting for other things we've talked about with iOS. Then macOS is similar. Here, you need Apple Configurator Profile Manager. You also can use the iMazing tool that I showed you. Again, be sure your setting that you choose is supported, and that your OS is supported. And then here's how this works. Again, the only difference is you're going to be targeting an Intune enrolled Mac for this setting because it is a Mac setting. So in terms of configuring this and showing it to you, it is basically identical for iOS. And so if I go back to my menu and look at devices and then look at macOS devices, we will see the same kind of mobile config. In fact, I didn't even go to the trouble of deploying this one because it's so similar. Right? But I did go ahead and create my custom configuration example. So if I go look at properties on this and then look at the details, you'll see the import of the mobile config like I showed you before, and there it is, right? So very much the same. So that's it. We're troubleshooting, same thing. Let's switch over to Android. So Android, so for Windows and iOS and macOS, there's a lot of settings that you can go configure with the custom configuration option. The CSPs and so on for Windows, all the things that you can do with Apple Configurator, or Profile Manager, or whatever with iOS and macOS. Then we get to Android. Android definitely has pathways that you can configure custom themes, but there's a lot fewer options for custom config. There are some other options beyond using direct addressing of the system for introducing custom type things, but in the traditional custom sense, there's just a few handful, if you will, of things you can do. So in terms of configuring, now this is going to start to look very much more like Windows. So I mentioned in the beginning that it really depends on the vendor how these things get implemented, right? And I'm showing you that. So you see one pathway for Windows, another for iOS, iPadOS, and macOS, now another for Android. So it really is up to the vendor. They all agree on the Open Mobile Alliance kind of configuration standard, but they implement it differently. So you need a configuration service provider. You need a particular OMA URI pathway to configure it on Android, right? And so now what's also interesting about Android, and I don't totally understand this, there are reasons. I've asked the question several times, and there are reasons for it, it seems, but I haven't totally closed the knowledge gap on my side as to why. But it's interesting, right? The custom configurations, if you look in the Intune console, they are only supported with personally owned work profile devices or devices that are enrolled as device administrator. Well, we shouldn't even talk about device administrator because that's been deprecated now for a while by Google. And if you have any devices that are enrolled as device administrator, they need to be rethought pretty quickly because this is deprecated. But what's interesting to me is the first one, right? Personally owned is one type of work profile, and then there's dedicated and single use or whatever. There's several other work profile kind of options. for Intune. But the only place where you will see the custom option is for personally owned work profile. Not exactly sure why that's the case and the others don't have it as well, but that is, in fact, the case, right? And then in terms of configuring, uh, on Android, I don't know why I put that there. That should not be there. I think what I did, sorry, and I'll have to go fix that, but I think what I did on this one is I was thinking about Mac OS whenever I was putting this together, because on the Mac OS, kind of like Windows, there are certain areas of things that we might want to manage that you just can't do natively on the Mac OS. And so on Mac OS, we install also the Intune management extension, but on Android, we don't. There's just MDM. So that's actually an erroneous slide. I should correct. But anyway, so we go through the MDM channel and drop the configuration down on the device directly through Intune, right? So I'll fix that slide when I'm done with the recording, so apologize for that, but hopefully that's clear. So how does this actually work? Well, it works very similar to the way it does with Windows. So let's go look at the configuration for Android and go from there. If you look at the documentation for Android, that's where you will see the various options that you have for configuring through the custom configuration channel. And there's, again, only a handful, right? So let's look at Android in the one example that I've put for custom here. So under configuration profiles, we have our custom configuration. And then if I go to properties on that, then I will edit my configuration setting. This all looks very Windows-like, right? And so editing, we see that there is, in fact, this OMA URI that we're using. Interesting that it's actually the Microsoft entry onto an Android device, but specifically here, we're going to disable cross-profile copy and paste. And so you do that with a Boolean value, set it to true. I went ahead and deployed. You might say that's a mistake because it's Microsoft and this is going to Android. Well, it looks odd. I will grant you that. But if I look at the actual deployment, I did target this to an Android device. This actually did succeed. If I look at the per setting status, I will again see that it succeeded. So it is a valid setting. Again, it's one of a handful of ones that you can do for Android, but it is absolutely valid, right? So troubleshooting, same way with Android, and so forth. So really, that wraps up what I wanted to show you in the session. There's some real strong value that you can get around custom configurations, whether you ever use them or not. Knowing that they're there, knowing how to access the detail about them, knowing the tools on the various platforms that you need to use to introduce these, if you need to, really important stuff. So at least awareness is good, and dabble around with it, play around with it, and we will wrap the session here, and we will see you next time.